As I recall last week, I had to take a break. I just got so tired of just looking back and thinking about all that work that had taken place in that cabin over the 35 years. I've had my coffee and now I'm back for another segment as we delve into the history of the cabin and things that went on back there. We have had a lot of different stoves in that cabin over the years. And I found this old picture, and this is what the farmer's deer camp had in there. It's an old-time propane stove, and it may have been their only source of heat because I never saw any real open hole going up through the roof when we got it for a chimney. But this is one of the things that we had to get cleaned up. We weren't going to use it, and I made mention of being out there one time with a shovel, and it's the only tool I had, but I kept pretty busy. Well, one reason I kept busy is because I dug a 7 by 7 foot hole by 7 foot deep, and I buried a lot of items such as this old stove. You'll recall the little laundry stove that we bought at Menards for $50 back in 1986, and we hauled it in there. And here's my friends. This was the second trip to the cabin with that stove, and they had to huddle around pretty good because they didn't have any dry firewood, and it was just really hard to coax enough heat out of that thing to overcome all the drafts and everything else that was going on with that cabin at that time. But when I took Wayne up there, he was so tickled to see that little laundry stove because it was the same stove that he had back in Illinois at a little cabin, and he was very proficient at using it. And he was worried about being warm, so when he saw that stove, he knew he was home free. Now what he would do is, under his bunk over there, he would have a stock of firewood. You know, in every camp there's always somebody who takes care of the fire. And when Wayne was around, that was him. And he sorted the firewood and he stacked the firewood, and he had ways to coax enough heat out of that stove that even with all the drafts, he could get it to 105 in there. I remember sometimes he'd have that little stove so full of coals that he couldn't open the front door, and he'd take that coffee pot off the top, and he'd take the little stove top off, the little circles they had with the stove pot holder, and he'd take them off, and that's the only way he could shove more fuel in was to put it through the top hole because he had it crammed that full. But he did know how to get all the heat out of that little stove. That little laundry stove just wasn't going to ever be a good stove for the cabin, and after a number of years, a friend in Minnesota happened to find this old Ashley stove, and they took it out of a basement or something, and they had no longer had a use for it, so he said, well, you should take that out to the cabin. And so I got the wheelbarrow out again, we hauled it in there, and it served us very well. The only trouble with it was that it was pretty well burnt out around the top, and there was so many air leaks that you had to watch how much wood you put in it, or you had that stovepipe just cherry red. Now, because of that, it did do a really good job of doing that cabin, but we just needed to look for something better. I have a fascination with old stoves, and they are one thing that always survive from these old homesteads. So if you look above that white coffee pot there, you'll see that the bottom of that wood box, that's where I keep my papers, and I fashioned an old stove door and put it on there. And then in another homestead, I found this old stove, and a friend Scott happened to mention that'd make a nice cupboard or something. So I took his idea and we brought it back, and I cleaned it up, and now that's a little corner cupboard over where I keep my toiletries all the time. That white Ashley stove was getting worse every year, and I'd put some tin inside, some putty and everything, but it was time for a change, and I was very fortunate that another friend, Jim and Nancy, they donated this Yodel parlor stove for our use at the cabin. They'd used it for a lot of years, and it's an old stove. I mean, it's probably back in the mid-70s when the big wood burning craze started. Everybody was picking up different kind of stoves, and this is the one that they chose. And it's worked out very well for us. But as I say I have a kind of a thing about old stoves, and you remember now my new side table there, that's the stove top from the cook range from a logging camp that stood about a mile away. So these old stove parts, they'll never rust away. As we take this tour outside, I'll start with probably what the most important thing outside is, and that is a decent outhouse. Of course, this old one was there we talked last week about. It had to go, and it did, in a ball of flame. And then another whole video is devoted to the bringing in this new outhouse from about a mile away. I broke it down and I brought it in panels and put a nice base under it, and I had to replace a lot of wood. And when I got done, I needed a new door, and all this debris on the ground here is because I took the extra time with a plane, and I cut up an old cedar with a chainsaw to make my planks, and then I took a little wood plane and I took enough time to really smooth it out and make a really nice door out of it. So now as we head out to the outhouse, and if you get a more modern picture, there's probably, that door isn't quite as bright because it's weathered slightly, and from the logging camp, the big oven over there, the big latch that did that logging camp oven, I brought that over, and that's my latch for the outhouse. But all these little things really worked out nice. One of my earlier videos is titled "The Bear Wanted In," and that documents the first time that a bear ever crashed into the cabin. Well, after the first time, I've always been kind of wondering what's going to happen, when I get to the cabin the next time. So every time that we'd arrive at the cabin, it was always you'd sigh a breath of relief when you realized that everything was intact, because it wasn't always the case. And I went back there one time, and as I approached the cabin, I'm taking that look around the corner when I could first see it to see if everything's okay, and I was greeted with this scene of this extra door in the corner of the cabin. After the first bear encounter, we started beefing up the windows with plywood so they couldn't break in that way, and this particular bear, it might have been the same one that came back, it was only like a year later, and it found a weak spot in the corner of the cabin, and it just tore all the logs out till they had a big enough hole to crawl in. Well, then as I got inside, we'd learned our lesson, and there was no food inside anymore, so it didn't find anything. It tore everything around, and it damaged things like that, and it may have tried coming in that back wall first, because it tore a log out of there too before it came in the other side of the cabin. And we haven't had this happen. This is like an old days thing, because we haven't had any bears get inside the cabin in a long time. But it is a little alarming when you go back there. Well, you get used to this, but there's bears live back there. It's their country. So when we come across tracks like this around the cabin, we're just glad they didn't do any damage, and they just kept on walking down the way. After the outhouse, this woodshed's a really nice addition that I built from scratch back there on the cabin site. Kind of knew what I wanted, and so one fall, knowing I wanted to work out in the spring, and I was afraid of the frost, because when I put the outhouse in, I couldn't dig the hole for the outhouse one year, because even in June it was still frozen too much. So I put the poles in the ground one fall, and I came back the next spring and started felling tamarack trees and hauling them out of the woods, and I put up this structure. I worked on it for, I might have taken a week to 10 days to put this thing up, and with a little bit of leverage and using different tricks, I could bring those logs in using that wheelbarrow. It was kind of tricky sticking out in front that much, but I could balance and haul them. And then pretty soon we had the time for the roof, and I salvaged that from a friend's shed out in Civilization, and again I brought it in by being creative with a wheelbarrow and kind of putting some extension 2x4s that ran pretty long. I could haul the tin in. But it really worked out good, because I had enough tin that I could, even though it was used tin and it had some holes in it, I was able to overlap everything, and you can see I kind of flattened out all that wood on top. And it's been a lot of years now, and that roof has held up very well, and it never leaked. In our first 20 years at the cabin, there was a lot more logging going on than there is now. The pulp industry, it's very cyclical. With the paper utes down, it just doesn't have as much need, so they're not taking near as much wood out as they used to. And the other thing is, when the aspen was in such demand, they virtually caught all the aspen back in my cabin area. So for the last decade, there really hasn't been any logging at all going on. And that, I don't mind the logging. It's a good thing. It gives a lot of habitat diversity for the wildlife, and they do a good job of managing it so that they don't take everything out at once. They just take pieces. So as I come across these guys out logging, sometimes they look at me as a cross-country skier and a hiker, and sometimes I can tell there's a little apprehension in their voice, but I'll talk to them and assure them that I don't have any trouble with them taking these trees out of the woods. One advantage of when the loggers are out there is that they'll come down through swamps and tangles of things that there's no way you could ever have a road through, but in the wintertime when things are frozen, they can get it packed down, and they've got it cleared enough that they got to be able to get their semis down these lanes. Well, then for years afterward, Martin's got a great hiking and ski trail that takes very little maintenance. So sometimes I kind of wish they'd maybe cut a little more timber out my way. When the loggers are making their winter roads, they just go over wet spots like this, and they would let it freeze hard, and they could take semis right over what was a boggy swamp all summer long. But this is one of my trails in the deep bog that I want to get across the wet area. So it takes a lot of work sometimes to cut all those dead cedar. They're dead, and I cut pieces out of them, and I'll lay them in. But they'll be good for decades once I do that, so it's well worth it. The earliest years also, there was a lot of time spent out some of the clearings in the old homestead yards and fields. We did spend some time to clear some of the dead debris off them and cut some of the invasive species. And now, in the later years now, the change is I just need to maintain them and do a little trimming. But in the early days, there was a lot of bigger wood laying on them, and so we would go out and gather that up in the wintertime even, and we make a fun day out of it, go out and have a nice fire, and I'm sure we probably brought some brats along. No sense in wasting a good hot fire like that. One thing that hasn't changed over the 35 years is just the enjoyment I get of being up in that cabin area, out in the forest, and whether it be one friend or 2 or 3 friends, or if at the time that I've just been up there alone and I get off to one of my little secret places, little special places I have. I have several of them up there in the forest, and I know where they're at, and I can get off to and take a little thermos of tea back there and just sit down and relish. Around the cabin yard, I never tire of my birds. Here's a good look at the gray jay, and they brought their young in, and they're feasting on one of my old chicken carcasses. But 35 years and watching these same bird species all the time, I never tire, because it just seems like it's unending enjoyment. When I walked up to the cabin the first time, right before I got into the cabin opening and saw the cabin, there were 2 spruce grouse feeding in the trees, and it's always a real treat to see a spruce grouse, especially back then when I hadn't seen them too much. But after all these years, I still don't tire of seeing my spruce grouse. Ever since that first night at that old cabin back in the January of 1986, friends have always been a very important part of my times back there. I think in the early years there was more friends back there because we made shorter trips to the cabin and more people were able to go up and enjoy it. Now that I go up for 3 weeks or a month, it's one reason I don't have as many people there for as long a time, but we still have plenty of time to enjoy it with our friends, and I relish those times. And as I look back at these pictures, it just reminds me of all the good times we've had as the cabin was in its previous state, and when we got it all polished up, and it was much more comfortable to be around. But this is my good friend Tim. He was up there many times, and now getting to the point here, I realize I need to pack. I'm heading back up to that cabin with a few friends at the end of the week. So probably as you're watching this, I'm going to be up there trying to film more adventures at Martin's cabin.